So good morning to everyone. People are coming into our virtual room where we host our third webinar together with the German Ministry of Economy and Climate Policy in preparation of their work at the G7 in the trade track, the so-called trade track. Today, we will talk about industrial subsidies and leveling the playing field. So we will talk about what the G7 can do to create more transparency and ensure that these subsidies do not distort trade. And the purpose of our webinars is that the Ministry of Economy, and in particular Dominik Schnichels, who's here, who leads the trade work, can pick up thoughts from civil society, from our panelists, but also from you, the audience. So don't be shy, be active in our chat. But also in the latter part of the webinar, we are going to take live questions from the audience, and we are looking forward to your comments. So on the panel today, we have my colleague Marion Jansen, who leads the trade work at the OECD. And she will present some work she has been doing with her team for the German G7 presidency. And we also have two distinguished experts for the subject. Gabrielle Massot is joining us from Canada in the middle of her night. She's a senior counselor at the research division of the WTO, and she's also a professor of WTO law, international law, at the University of Geneva. So she can give us many insights. And Mikko Huhtadi is the executive director of the Mercator Institute for China Studies. And since this is a discussion that's also ongoing with China, he can give us important inputs there. Well, without further ado, I will give the word to Dominik Schnichels, and who will introduce the subject, and then we will take it from there.
So, good morning, and also a very warm welcome from my side. I hope you can all hear me well. The body language of Nicola suggests that it is the case. Indeed, very good, and very much a big thank you to you, Nicola, for hosting and organizing and moderating today, as you did our previous two, and it really was a great pleasure. Also, a big thank you to our three distinguished panelists who have at least as far as Marion is concerned, already helped us out in one of the previous sessions. This third webinar is really important for the preparation of our third and last G7 trade track discussion on level playing field and subsidies. I think this is a really important subject for us. It's a really important WTO subject as well. We all know that I think everybody, it's a global phenomenon. Everybody gives subsidies, including ourselves. In preparation, we discussed sort of all the big subsidies that Germany has been giving also in recent years. But when you look at the international statistics and some studies, you can see that China, when it comes to sort of in relative terms in relation to GDP, gives 4 times more subsidies than the US or Germany. So in that sense, I think it's also an interesting question. I'm very happy that Mikko is in the call, who can probably shed some light on this issue. The purpose of the webinar is, like in the previous ones, that I'm listening very carefully to your great comments and ideas, so that we can better prepare the discussions of the G7, which will take place in the coming weeks. Without then much further ado, back to Nicola, who will probably start with the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dominik, for this introduction. And I suggest that we listen first to Marion. She's a seasoned researcher also in this field with her team. The OECD has done much analytical work on the subject, and she can tell us, I think, what the state of transparency is, how to think about industrial subsidies and how to untangle, well, how important they are and perhaps also what their nature is. Marion, you have the word.
Thank you, Nicola, and also thank you, Dominic, for the introduction. We have been looking at the OECD for decades, actually, well before I joined the OECD, on the issue on subsidies. The OECD has produced concepts around and data sets on agricultural subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, fishery subsidies, and a lot of that work has, we hope, helped, or that we have been told helped negotiators to discuss how to deal with subsidies in a multilateral trade setting. Before going to my slides and before focusing on industrial subsidies, maybe a few introductory words to position this theme. The subsidy issue is not just a global debate issue. It was a very important aspect of discussions among EU members when the EU was created. The EU state aid rules are a fundamental element of the EU's open market policy, and those rules define what a government can do and cannot do in order to support companies with a view on not distorting competition, to ensure some type of competitive neutrality in the single market. So also within a big market like the EU, this theme is important. And second, when we look at this issue at the OECD, we also very much look at it with a point of view, from a point of view, how can what we do be useful for negotiators, but also be useful at some stage for decisions on what works and what doesn't work in order to find agreement among parties. Gabriel will say more about this, but from being somebody who has worked on disputes like the Airbus first and the Boeing dispute when I was at the WTO, I can tell you that these are very difficult issues to deal with, and issues that are of important economic value. Those are issues that involve big industries sometimes and important monetary interests for companies and for governments. So let me go to the slide and focus on industrial subsidies, and a colleague is going to upload those slides. We have already heard from Dominic, everybody subsidizes, and that's really one of the main conclusions of the main statements of a joint study the OECD recently did with the WTO, with the IMF and the World Bank, where we looked at subsidies through the angle of the four agencies. And we did indeed find that pretty much every WTO member does subsidize in one way or the other. And one of the particularities is indeed that it's being done in so many different ways. And I will delve a bit more deeply into this. Next slide, please. Here what you see is a chart that shows in how many how many sectors in industry we do find government support, and we have combined here two types of government support: government grants and below market borrowings. I would like to say three things here. First, the industrial subsidies. So industrial subsidies are widespread, so they are in many sectors. Second, you see here sectors that you also read about in the news regularly. Aluminium oversupply, cement oversupply, solar photovoltaic panels. How come China took over that market where European countries were positioned so well? What is going to happen to wind turbines? Shipbuilding, pretty much produced in the Asian regions. The market is relatively concentrated here. Steel oversupply, aerospace, of course, highly sensitive, and automobiles, a key sector for the country that I'm speaking in digitally. So here we are discussing sectors that are of the heart of national industrial production, but also often of the heart of geostrategic industrial interests or of importance for security matters. Some of these sectors, I'm thinking of steel, have also become more important in recent discussions around the resilience of supply chains, because we are realizing that if something is missing at the beginning of the supply chain, we don't get towards the end. Next slide, please. When we think of subsidies in the industrial sector in the context of ensuring a level playing field for members of the WTO, we have a lot of challenges, but there are two that are very important. One is transparency. We may have the impression that other countries are supporting the industry more than we do, or in a way that is not appropriate. But in order to discuss this among countries in a consensus-focused way, it is important to have transparency, and it is important that everybody has access to the same data. And that transparency currently doesn't exist, in particular not when it comes to subsidies for industries. Then, if we were to know who is doing what, who is providing how much support to which sectors, then it is nevertheless still important to be able to distinguish between a subsidy that distorts competition in a way that is not acceptable, or in a subsidy, in a support measure that we can accept. Sometimes for simplicity, we use the distinctions between good subsidies and bad subsidies, but this is really just use of easy wording when it comes to, in reality, identifying when is government support to research and development too much, or done in a way that helps the national industry and hurts foreign industries, when is support for the environmental performance of the sector appropriate, or it's really designed to help my own industry. Making that distinction is not easy. And yes, I do hope as an economist that economists can contribute to making that distinction, but we do not have silver bullets, and I look forward to hearing more from the other speakers on this topic. Let me go show two slides on the transparency challenges. Next slide, please. Here you see a slide that is shows data that are not in the reflected in the first slide on support, but what I want to emphasize here, that often support in industry goes really deeply into the functioning of the financial sector. So one thing we have, for instance, found in our OECD work is that in sectors that are heavily research and development dependent, what we are seeing is a lot of below market equity returns. So for some reasons, something makes it possible for these companies to survive, even though they are not delivering the returns that they should be having on their revenue. So we are having to dig in order to find this kind of evidence into financial data to find hints at support, and it's not the kind of data we have been used to work with in the area of subsidies or government support. Next slide, please. Here we see a bit more in detail some of the data that you have already seen before. I showed you in the first slide information on grants and below market borrowing. Here only below market borrowing, and you see that that's very predominant in sectors where there are economies of scale, but economies of scale of more traditional type that are not necessarily research and development dependent. I'm thinking here of the aluminium sector and of shipbuilding, for instance, or of steel. What I would like you to remember from these slides is maybe a bit their fanciness, and I would ask you to imagine how much work goes into digging these things out. But I would also like you to remember that we are here looking at firm level information that is related to the financial performance of the firms. That's not the kind of thing you can easily find. Here we're using publicly available data, but this is information that would be a different type of information than what we are used to collect for transparency tools in the WTO context when it comes to subsidies. So we are here in a different space in the industrial sector. So the transparency need exists. It is not an easy one to achieve, and I look forward to discussing this. Last slide. Oh no, it's not the last one slide. Yes, on the transparency, but I already said this, it's not only government information that we need, and typically the WTO works with government information. We are looking here very firm level, and that's maybe a bit of an innovation in this industrial side. So happy to explore what this implies, what this it means from a WTO point of view. But one thing that this joint study between the OECD, the IMF, the WTO, and the World Bank has offered, I already referred to that study. One thing we offered is that as a combination of international organizations, given the effort that we have in front of us, we stand definitely ready to support any exercise in that direction, not only as individual agencies, but also in a collaborative way, as we have been doing for the study. Next slide, please. Only one slide on distinguishing good subsidies from bad subsidies. I think most policymakers, most economists, also lawyers will accept that there can be perfectly valid justifications for government support to the private sector. And unfortunately, we have been going through a period, I'm thinking COVID-19 situation, where the government had to step in to help its country. So yes, there are valid reasons, but there are ways to design subsidies that make them more distortive or others. And sometimes the choice of which sector are you going to have and which one are you not going to have is already a signal of distortions. It's not easy, not even using economic models, to exactly distinguish what is a good subsidy from what is a bad subsidy. And often you will have to dig into the detail and use the data available in the market. And here we are back to the chicken and egg problem. We will need transparency, not only to know whether government support is happening, we will also need transparency in order to distinguish between the good and the bad, to distinguish where in the gray zone between what is acceptable and what is not acceptable we are, and therefore to find ways to have governments trading, countries trading with each other, but to do this in a way that is fair and that reflects a level playing field. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, Marion, thank you very much for this introduction. Before I go on to ask Gabrielle about the state of play at the WTO, just one question for clarification. So what you said is that when you look at the data and the charts that you showed us, these are not necessarily data that countries provided in order to disclose what they're doing, but you were using firm data and were extracting the data from there. Is that correct?
These are data that are, in this case, publicly available, but they come from the accounting system. So it's the firms revealing how they are performing and what, and potentially revealing what they receive. But it is indeed data that come from the firm level, and if they are available, it's based on often because of transparency requirements to the firms. So the firms, in order to act in certain markets, have to show their own financial accounts.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, Gabrielle, because just building on what Marion just told us. So she said, one, in a first instance, we need to have information about what countries are doing in terms of subsidies. And then two, a second step, even more complicated, countries would have to sit together, the G7 potentially, and more countries at WTO members would have to sit together and decide where this is a good subsidy because it addresses some market failure, it helps to develop green technologies, and this other subsidy is a bad subsidy, which we shouldn't have. And what I would like to know from you is what's the state of play? Do you have the right tools to get the data from the countries? And then in the second step, from there, where are we in terms of the methodological discussion? Because that's apparently what is needed.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me. There are provisions at the moment in the WTO treaty about subsidies, agriculture and industrial, and there are obligations of notification and transparency. We may discuss further how to improve them, but this is one of the basic problems. The existing provisions are not always respected. So even if you add and repeat, you must notify. The issue now is how to deal with situations when some governments do not notify. The other point that I would add is it was well said, information is also needed from the private sector. And although many people say we need to include more and more the private sector, this was true recently in the pandemic with vaccine and producers, private sector don't think like government, and asking them to reveal their price, their transaction, is not that easy. It's not a normal reflex for the private sector. So some of the challenge are deep, and they're not just about government not doing things. So I'll limit to this. My last point before we talk about reform and other questions is in the original WTO treaty, there were 3 types of subsidies: the red prohibited, the green always okay, and the yellow in the middle. And the green phased away because they were there for 5 years and developing countries didn't agree to expand them. But we will see that some proposals are put forward to expand those categories, to try to set up criteria that would help determine when it's good and bad. But it's really a terribly difficult question that depends on circumstances. Thank you. You're muted.
Yeah, that's the sorry. So basically what you're saying is that there's an effort to have some sort of taxonomy also for subsidies in order to be able to categorize them. Is that correct?
Well, there is already categories that exist, but they're too limited and not sophisticated enough to deal with new issues, such a new government role, such as China's role. So there is something, but maybe not developed enough.
Because we have one question from the audience, Chris Kowalewski. He's asking, so in terms of determining good and bad, do you take into consideration corruption and illegitimate lobbying that can become a distorting factor? Is that something that's already considered in
not to my knowledge. At the moment, there are 2 prohibited subsidies: local content and export subsidies. The others, it depends on their impact, whether they have adverse effect. So this is what maybe needs to be further developed. There are other proposals, but this is one area, important area of proposal, expanding criteria and definitions to cover more situations that affect, that constitute subsidies directly or indirectly. At the moment, you need financial contribution for it to be a subsidy under WTO rules. So financial contribution is a fundamental criteria.
Very well. Miko, I was wondering when Dominic said, you know, we are discussing, we were already in the middle of the discussion, what is a good subsidy, what is a bad subsidy? But I want to go back to something that Dominic said at the beginning. He said, well, you know, we are all giving subsidies and we know that, but if you look at the data, 4 times more in China than I think he said the United States. So China's giving a lot of subsidies. The OECD work also points that out. But is this because they're more transparent or because they're giving more subsidies? What are your insights there?
Thank you, Nicola, and thanks for the opportunity of being here. I think the question is very well formulated, but let me start maybe with a general point. If we look at the big picture, market distortions in China, I think we should start by noting that trends towards convergence have at least slowed down, if not reversed. And you don't have to believe a China Institute in Berlin. You can believe Chinese experts who say that there are no real substantive signs that China's industrial policy is changing towards more convergence. But indeed, I think what's important also to note that the way how government intervention and support for instance, strategic emerging technologies, etc., is being channeled at companies is shifting quite dramatically. So we have an extremely dynamic picture where not just the size and scope, but the modalities of state support are actually changing. It's extremely hard for policymakers to grapple with these changes and adjust their tools and instruments to that. So it is right to talk about China today as an incubator state, as the financialization of state capitalism moves to earlier phases of industrial policy. And this is something that the WTO simply does not cover in many ways. So yes, we have traditional tools, direct subsidies, tax exemptions, etc. But as I think Marion Janssen pointed out very clearly with her analysis by the OECD, what is much more important are other aspects: below market equity, export credit, insurance, dominant position below market debt. These tools are issues where it's extremely hard to get at numbers, country specific. To get at instruments will be even harder. But back to your question, the size is just remarkable of the state support, and it's not going to go away. On the contrary, it's actually increasing in many ways. So in the figure that has been raised, I mean, we're looking at a massive number for state support in relation to GDP in China that is not comparable to any of the other, and certainly not to OECD states. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Marion, with the questions we're getting from the audience, I'd like to bring you in again because you're involved a lot in the analysis. And you already pointed out how difficult it is to decide whether a subsidy is good or bad. So Michael Lapp is asking, he's pointing out that in order to decide on good or bad, one question you have to ask is cui bono, so who would generally benefit from the subsidy? And another question, so my question to you would be, is that correct? Is that one way you try to assess whether a subsidy is distortive or addressing market failures? And another one, he says, it's about delayed impacts. Isn't that particularly difficult when, it's not immediately that you see the distortion, but perhaps later? Is that another challenge you're grappling with?
I think we are unfortunately even earlier in the stage of trying to understand what is going on. So we are still far away from that final point of identifying the criteria of when is something like distortive or not. What we are facing in the industrial sector, and Mikko made reference to this, is a different way of intervening than we are used to from the other sectors on which work exists. I'm thinking notably of the agricultural sector, and these interventions happening in a period where financial markets are very developed. So we are working with a type of support that goes in a sophisticated way through the financial market. And our work has really focused on turning a suspicion, something is happening here, into evidence, but using data that we have not been using so far or previously in the context of the subsidies discussion at the WTO. From here, a next step would be, what would be a next step in order to tackle the WTO challenges, to think about what could be rules to ensure that the subsidies that are used are not distortive, and how can then these rules be implemented. And for this, typically, it will be important to find ways to monitor the information, the subsidies that we consider of concern. So here the rules should and often in an ideal case, be designed in a way that also thinks already of the transparency imperative. Because if you have a rule that you can never implement because you can never find data on them, it's not going to be very helpful. I would think that then when we think about these rules, the issues that were raised from the audience would come up. But in the OECD work, we are definitely not at that stage. I would expect that Gabrielle may have some thoughts on this. I'm not sure whether she would be able to speak on that.
Yeah, thank you, Gabrielle. I'm not sure either, but you will speak if you can. But there's another question from the audience that I wanted to give to you, which is from Jürgen Mattis, and he asked. He says there was an effort by the WTO and the WTO framework to create transparency with a naming and shaming approach, and he was wondering how that worked. Do you have something to say there? Is that correct? Was that an approach, and was that successful?
Thank you. There is an existing provision on what is called counter or cross notification, where a government can notify when that government believes another one should have notified but didn't do it. We have a few events of such exchange between India, China, US. It is not considered so successful. I mean, it is aggressive, and it is still a part of the existing proposals. When you ask me, is it successful? Well, I think the existence of today's meeting confirms that it didn't work properly, and it's not sufficient, and it's not detailed enough because countries don't necessarily change, and we need to elaborate further. And this is why what Marion just said about not only transparency, but monitoring, because we need to know and understand better before we propose better rules, because the existing one of cross notification is working, but is not successful fully enough, at least.
Thank you very much. So, Dominic, I think there are questions also for you in the audience. Or I'm curious about that too. But one person asked, so how big are the chances of WTO to improve the implementation of transparency? And of course, you put this subject on the G7 agenda. So probably you have some vision about what the G7 could do in order to make come up with mechanisms that are perhaps more successful than the naming and shaming one. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that, perhaps also what you think about the inputs that you got until now. And a second thing I would question or comment I would like to put to you is again from Chris Kowalewski, who said, well, look, the corruption issue is really important when it comes to distinguishing between good and bad. So is that something, because the G7 in other contexts considered this to be a very important subject. So is this something you're looking at concretely in these discussions at the G7 level?
Well, first of all, really many thanks to the panelists already for the great input. I think when it comes to the question, what are our expectations at WTO level, I think we need to distinguish what can be done on the basis of the existing rules. And I think there, like Gabrielle has said, we have already today transparency obligations, but it seems that the members of WTO are not really following up on them in an adequate manner. And so there is a big lack of concrete sort of information and notifications to the WTO. I think including also in all fairness and honesty from European countries, we have, of course, a system in Europe, the state aid rules, where all the state aid has to be notified to the European Commission. So in that sense, we have a lot of transparency, but we are not notifying necessarily to WTO. And I had the pleasure of working 12 years in DG competition, where the state aid rules are applied. So for me, this is absolutely fascinating to hear this discussion now, and I think it suggests that the European Union, which has reflected a lot about the good and bad and what should be allowed and what should be banned, I think can be made useful, because it's also an international, a European, but international dimension. What is a distortion of competition and what is a legitimate subsidy? But when it comes to the transparency, my question to Gabrielle would be very much, what can WTO do in order to make sure that member states are sort of increasing their notification obligation? The second point, I think that also was mentioned already, was that I think also Gabrielle said not all forms of subsidies are currently covered by the WTO rules. There are new forms of subsidies which are not yet covered, and I think that would be something that would require a change of the current rule book, and I think that would be would be a very important step forward. In my view, it would be very good. But of course, if we have, if we know WTO, we have to decide ultimately with unanimity. Everybody has to be in favor. Yeah. So that is quite a challenge, and I could foresee quite some resistance, at least from some countries that are probably giving a lot of state aid, that they would not really like to extend it and make transparent all the other subsidies that they are giving. So the question that always is sort of then needs to be addressed is, do you want to move forward just with the coalition of the willing, the plurilateral approach? Do you actually do that? And in a way, you could say, yes, that would be useful, but it would ultimately, of course, leave out those where it is most important to find out. So it is probably not the ideal approach, but I think that's something that we could certainly discuss in the G7 context. When it comes to the reasons, because I think the notion of distortion of competition or lack of level playing field, I think we all would agree that distortion is a notion that needs to be filled with life. It is what is a distortion? Yeah? And I think for that reason, I would be very much interested whether Marian has done. Is my microphone muted? Can you hear me? You can hear me, okay. Because I get funny messages here. Good. What are good reasons for a subsidy and what are bad reasons for a subsidy? And just to give you sort of some ideas from also my time when I was in DG competition, what we were looking at, is it if you are trying to support an area in your country that is underdeveloped, is that legitimate that you give subsidies for regional development? You also have a sort of strategic security reflections. You are seeing that certain key technologies, such as very recently semiconductors, are very much concentrated in the hands of a limited number of suppliers or countries. Is it legitimate to build up a semiconductor industry and subsidize that in order to attract the investment so that they come to your country? You have situations of market failure. I worked also for some years in the health sector, and we were always wondering, how can we attract investment of pharmaceutical companies into antibiotics, because we have an antimicrobial resistance issue, and the pharma companies are not investing. Why are they not investing? Because if you have an antibiotic, you apply it for a week and then the patient is cured. So it's not really a blockbuster that you develop, like if you treat a chronic disease, high blood pressure. You have the patient, you have him ideally for life, and so you can sell. But if you're looking at the antibiotics, you are actually developing that not to use this ideally, and you will only use it for a very short period of time. So it's not commercially attractive. Is that a legitimate reason to invest or subsidize? You have also, and I think Marion has mentioned that very clearly, you have situations where countries subsidize sectors that have excess capacity. So why are they subsidizing this excess capacity in the steel sector or cement, I think was mentioned? And I think that's for me an interesting one. Is it because it is in a region which is otherwise underprivileged, or is it because you are taking a strategic approach? I think something that Miko also hinted to. Is it a question sort of who survives, which company survives, and then ultimately takes over the market? Yeah, and that could be sort of the story behind the solar panels. So I think, yeah, how do we distinguish between good and bad? I think is a big question in subsidies. I would have a lot of other questions, but I think I leave it at that.
Yeah, and we have further rounds. Thank you. I think that's a lot of food for thought for the upcoming discussion. I have one follow-up in terms of the, we said, so the distinguishing good and bad is incredibly difficult. I think that's clear. But we have a first step to do, which is, providing the data, supplying the data. And you said, Dominic, well, even the European Union, we have it amongst ourselves, but we don't necessarily give it to the WTO. So my question here is, how about, and something you also said could be an option, plurilateralism or, coalition of the willing. So leading by example, is that something you're considering within the G7, or is it not a good moment for that because there are too many tensions? Why is that? Is that on the table?
It could be on the table in the meeting in sort of 2 weeks' time, and I think it would probably be good to be on the table. But of course, I mean, there's a reason why there is a lack of transparency, because everybody thinks if they are the first mover, then everybody jumps on that, and so normally being a first mover might be an advantage, but here it could turn out into a boomerang. So you have to be very careful about that, and you might get lots of questions. You get more questions than you have answers.
Yeah.
So that's something that has to be considered. So there's one additional question I would like to raise, I think probably very much also to Gabriel and Marion. I think there's also a difficult definition of what is a subsidy. It's a really difficult one. I think we all say, yeah, it is financial support. Okay, fine. But if Apple does a deal with Ireland that they don't pay the normal tax rate, but they get a huge tax reduction, is that a state aid? Yeah. If you build new infrastructure, you build a new motorway and railway connection to a factory, is that state aid for this company? Mm-hmm. There was a famous case in Europe, Preußen Elektra case, where for renewable energy, a surcharge was introduced in Europe that all German, in Germany, that all German consumers had to pay if they, in order to co-finance, to give a minimum price to renewables. Yeah, at the end, the Court of Justice decided that's not state money. It was state imposed. It was compulsory introduced, but it was not money coming from the state, but money coming from the consumers. So what is state aid? I think, or what is subsidy? I think it's a very, very tricky question. It's not just the situations where a state pays 500 million to a company, build a factory here. That's the easy ones, but there are lots of very tricky ones.
Yeah, and you're not making it easier, Dominic, with your examples. But yeah, it is tricky. But before I go, so you had a lot of questions. I do want to discuss them with Marion and Gabrielle. So what is a subsidy? What is a good? What is a bad subsidy? I have one question to you, Miko, because we had this question also the first step, notifying, perhaps also the analysis. My question would be, so we discussed, could a group of countries make a first step, lead by example? But now we know there's a lot of state aid, and you said it wouldn't go away in China in different forms. And the question is, what's a good way, from your perspective as a China expert, to talk with China about this? So to find a way that countries, China's partners and China do create some transparency and work together on a notion of what is an acceptable, good, or not so harmful subsidy, and what is clearly a subsidy that will distort international trade.
Thank you, Nicola. And I think we have to be extremely realistic on this. On the formal side of things, President Xi Jinping, I think last December, said that they are open for conversations about industrial subsidies. That was in 2021, Import-Export Expo, or that they would have an active and open attitude to discussing these issues. Lo Jiwei, former finance minister, said a similar thing just a few months ago. So it's time to talk about industrial subsidies, but obviously that is a very strategic signal that would also imply lots of compromises and a lengthy process that will probably take a decade, if not longer, to get to any results. So that is fantastic, and I think we should start it, but we need to be realistic about the timeline and the outcomes. And in the meantime, there's a lot to be done with a like-minded group of countries, specifically the trilateral, but most likely the G7 also has to play a role in that, in making sure that the other types of distortions that will escalate in that period, that we have adequate policy responses, which will most likely not be in the WTO format. So I think that's the only realist assessment that we have to come to at this point. And by nature, these responses themselves would need to be WTO compliant and obviously be pursued in a way that they don't lead to clashes between China and the rest of the world. So short answer is, I think it's a dual track approach. One is expanding the system slowly to cover more and be more transparent and make progress in a step-by-step way, which will take a long time. And then the other is dealing with the urgent and the big challenges that will arise in parallel to that.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Gabrielle, so you had a question from Dominic, basically, but it's backed up also by something that comes from the audience. So Dominic asked, what can the WTO do to improve, let's say, notification compliance, discipline compliance? And in the audience, somebody who's, well, I don't know the name, J.A. Asked, and I think that's an interesting question, is there a way to think of a system where you don't blame and shame, but you create clear benefits to the participants who will notify others, perhaps other participants, and then think about this methodology which is needed to find a way to classify subsidies? Is that something the WTO or the members are thinking about, and is that a way forward, perhaps?
Thank you. Yes, I think this may be a way forward to identify the economic benefit of a notification, but of course it's always short and long term. And I do think that the approach mentioned by Dominique and Miko about starting with a small group. And this is also the idea of this proposal for a new G7 working group of experts that would not only continue the work of Marion and the other experts on trying to understand what's happening, what are really the effect of existing actions. But I'd like to raise also 2 points that we haven't touched much, maybe Dominique did, about this definition of what is a subsidy. For instance, under WTO, and a subsidy needs to be specific, be given to a specific group or a specific area. If it's given to all, it's not a subsidy. And I remember years back discussing with OECD economists, and for them, it's really weird. Why is it? These were negotiations and concession made. So yes, the definition, the scope of subsidy, but 2 other points that are very important, very legal, but real, is that in WTO, what is really important is who gives the subsidy. Is it a WTO member? And in the case of China, where the subsidy may not be given by the government, but rather by another entity, whether it's the state trading, a state owned, this is a big issue. And this is where the OECD proposal of years back on competitive neutrality is so fundamentally good. And this was taken over and proposed by the EU last year, I think so, 12 months back, competitive neutrality, where essentially the idea is forget whether it's the government, a firm, an entity, what is given, what is the impact of this benefit given. And so that's very important, dealing with the actors in subsidy. And the last point, and I'll stop, is the new subsidies that we call transnational subsidies. That is China giving subsidies to a sub-firm, a sister firm, let's say in Egypt, that exports in EU. At the moment, the international rules are state-based. They're a bit outdated with digitalization and supply chains and all that. So we need to rethink not only criteria about what is good and bad, but the whole role of government in the economy. And this is an enormous challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we already get some hints, and Marion, there were a lot of difficult questions for you, but you'll have to make an attempt to answer. So basically, what is good, what is bad, what are your analytical tools, what is your thinking at the moment? There was also a question from the audience where somebody wanted to have, what Abhishek, he wanted to have examples of particular good or bad subsidies, and that's also a theme that's running through the discussion. So maybe if it's so difficult to say good or bad, maybe there's excellent and then there's really, really bad. So are there some easy distinctions to be made, and what can you say in answer to the many questions you also got from Dominique?
Thank you. I think there are very few easy answers in this discussion. In the questions from Dominique, the reference was sometimes often made to which objectives are acceptable. And I think here's one of the few answers where we have something easy to say. There are 2 objectives, and Gabriela already mentioned them, that are not accepted. When you give a subsidy in order to export, so export subsidies, these are not accepted. And what is interesting here is that those subsidies are not accepted because the objective is not accepted. For all the other objectives that you mentioned, Dominique, environment, regional support, research and development, there will be a whole panoply of objectives that, that's my understanding, Gabriel, where the objective would be accepted by the WTO. Then in order to decide, is support where you claim to be pursuing this objective that is legitimate, is it nevertheless designed in a way that is really rather distorted than pursuing the objective, finding that balance, that's where things become very tricky. And there are no easy answers. What we have seen at sometimes, and Gabriele already referred to this, that certain objectives were highlighted as potentially maybe more important, for instance, supporting the environment. So that's a way of somehow signaling, if I have to weigh between the objective and the potential of distorting, I maybe give a bit of a more emphasis, weight on the objective. Because ultimately, in such a balance, we are also balancing between the objective and the distortion to trade. It's something you can do in a model theoretically, but if you apply it in real life, this is not easy. Now, sometimes in the past we thought one thing you should always do is use what we call as economists a first best policy. Even that doesn't work. If to help an SME, I need information, and information is very costly, it may simply be easier to lower the credit rate for that SME. And that could even be accepted by an economist to move into the second best. So no easy answers. But one thing I think we could maybe take away from here is to see that there is a relationship between certain debates taking place in competition policy and debates that are taking place in the context of subsidies at the WTO. Many of the examples Dominique mentioned from his competition policy experience are examples that also exist in the WTO case law. Is this infrastructure investment distorted? Are these taxes distorted? So there is a clear parallel, and that also is reflected in the fact that the recommendation on competitive neutrality, the OECD recommendation on competitive neutrality, it comes from the competition committee and not from the trade committee. So there is maybe a thinking that we could start together with other of the ideas that have been put forward in this debate.
Thank you very much, Marion. And we have a direct question from the audience about one specific type of subsidies. So Marianne Lotz of the WWF has a question here for, I think, Gabriele. Marianne, I think you should be unmuted and able to speak.
Yes, thank you so much for giving me the floor also. Yeah, when we are thinking about categorizing subsidies in good and bad and helpful, not helpful, of course, my mind firstly goes to the question of to which extent are they helpful or not helpful to reaching our goals for climate protection. And the G7 has voiced their commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies for many years now, also this year to end them by the year 2025. And the first step here would be, of course, also to define what is subsidy that is harmful for the climate, or what is a fossil subsidy, and to create shared inventories. And my question would be if the WTO intends to support the G7 and their commitment to do this and to finally implement it. And yeah, and I'd like to connect to the points made before that really defining subsidies in this regard can also help set goals actually in which direction these subsidies should go to, and to go on from there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marianne. Yeah, perhaps I want to give this question to several people, but perhaps Gabriele, you could start. So, of course, this is also work supported by the OECD and the IEA, I think, to identify these fossil fuel subsidies, and indeed at G7, I think also G20 commitment for a long time to reduce them, to abolish them. Is that a subsidy where we can clearly say, so this is ugly, this must go away, and is that then a starting point to make progress?
There is a new group, a new GSI, which is the name we give Joint Statement Initiative, where a subgroup starts on fossil fuel. So it is clearly for that group an issue that must be addressed. And on those new GSI, what is good is that it's not the traditional WTO member only. Firms can be invited on and all this. Now, the WTO country to the EU, where the Commission has autonomy to initiate, there's no such a thing as the WTO taking position. The G7 has a view, China has a view, so it's not yet clear what is the overall position, but there's a new group, so that's already a step forward. The only other comment I was going to add on this issue, there's so many interesting questions, is that it's a bit adding to what Marion said about this necessary balance between the distortion caused by subsidies, because subsidies by definition distort, but it could be best in light of the overall impact. This, the issue of the level and the amount of subsidy. Is it that any subsidy of any functioning, because it aims at helping the environment, is good? And I don't think so. This is where it gets complex. We could say subsidies for climate change are good or can be good, but which ones are the best so that they don't hurt those who would necessarily lose a little bit? And this balance is terribly difficult. And it's not a legal question, it's a lot of economic question. We need to understand really the impact of one or the other intervention in the market. So I think we can say, yes, the WTO believes that fossil subsidies are bad, or a good deal of members do, since we have now this sort of new committee and we deal with it. But is it going to work? I'm an optimistic. And I'd like to reiterate what Marion said, which I also greatly believe. The concept of competitive neutrality, in my personal opinion, is the door to considering new approach, including the role of firms and these hybrid entity in China that are not firms, not government, not municipality. We need to look at the effects of things rather than traditional criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I continue asking questions, I do want to encourage the audience. I think this question by Marianne was very helpful. So if you want to go live, you know, there's a really good chat going on. But if you're happy to ask your questions live, perhaps you can raise either your virtual hand or also indicate so in the chat that you would be happy to ask, to put your questions to the panel. Yeah, Marion, perhaps building on this question. So the OECD does a lot of work also on fossil fuel subsidy. But somebody in the audience or in the chat also pointed out, well, you know, yes, many countries agree we should reduce fossil fuel subsidies, but it's incredibly difficult. And of course now there's a global energy crisis. So well, there are two things, I think. Subsidies sometimes automatically increase incredibly when they're tied to prices. So that could be an opportunity to think again and reduce. On the other hand, there's a need for different so there is the energy scarcity is looming. So fossil fuel, at least in the short term, will have some renaissance. So how do you see that? It's a good moment or a bad moment to make progress? And is it a subsidy where you can be clear that should go away, or is it more complicated, as Gabrielle said, that even environmental subsidies to improve the green transition can be harmful?
This is definitely a difficult moment to discuss fossil fuel subsidies. If you ask, are fossil fuel subsidies potentially distorted? Yes. Are they potentially environmentally harmful? Yes. So it's easy to make the argument against fossil fuel subsidies. But if in a country where that depends on certain fossil fuels, and where consumers are now very much suffering from high prices. If you ask a policymaker, is it good to reduce those prices for consumers to intervene in the market, then many policymakers would say yes. So there are three objectives here: one, not legitimate, distorting the market, and two, competing objectives, environment and distributional effects. That said, what is the case is that if we were less fossil fuel dependent, then we wouldn't need to help consumers to have lower prices when they use fossil fuel. So definitely this is a moment to rethink dramatically where support is directed and to bring that support more and more into renewable energies. And I think this is something that is happening in many places, because ultimately it would be much better if a decade from here, or maybe even earlier, you do not need to use, for good reasons, subsidization to fossil fuels, because you simply do not depend it anymore. This is the direction support must take. So the easy aspect many people will agree on is redirection of support to energy has to change. There has to be a redirection into renewables. This is also the big message that came out of the OECD IEA latest press release on subsidies, because indeed fossil fuel subsidies have increased dramatically between 2020 2021, a bit because of a technical effect. When prices go up, the subsidies go up too, but also because governments feel now the need sometimes to help poorer households. So out of this, yes, sad to see fossil fuel subsidies are increasing, even though governments have committed to reduce them. We support the discussions that are going on at the WTO, as Gabriel mentioned, with our data. And we support member countries and others in their attempts to redirect energy use into renewables. And this is a challenging but very important and increasingly urgent exercise.
Thank you. Miko, when I think coming back to China again, and this really difficult questions about good and bad subsidies and then environmental subsidies. So certainly, as you pointed out, there are a lot of industrial subsidies in China for many different purposes. I'm sure also there's strategic interests, but they also do quite a bit to promote this green transition, right? Also because they see with their really fast industrial development, they see the environmental downsides. It just had a terrible drought, but also the air quality, etc. How would you assess that? Is that a good a starting point to discuss with China? So having this common goal of promoting the green transition, is that a way to talk about what kind of subsidies are acceptable and then analyze together?
In principle, I think yes. I mean, green environmental subsidies are one of the most dynamic picture in China. So it is certainly a topic that has high policy relevance for them. When I said earlier that it is, a very dynamic picture, it is, for instance, the case that, the cuts for electric vehicles and renewable subsidies just in the past 6 to 12 months are quite remarkable. So they're working on this for industrial policy reasons, because the way how they steer competition is changing. So in principle, I think finding such a specific perspective cutout sector is a good way forward to lead such conversations. Again, going back, you always have to understand what the big boss is saying, and an active and open attitude is related also to the issue of environmental subsidies, I would argue. Now, how effective that is, I think we all know the persistence and the difficulties of actually coming to negotiated outcomes with China. But I think you have an entry point here for a constructive discussion. I would agree with that.
So Dominic, we had a long, perhaps you want to intervene and reflect a little bit about what has been said, but also I have one concrete question, this because you are from the Ministry of Economy and Climate Policy, so that that issue, of course, is dear to your heart. So is that something you're exploring in the G7 work, whether thinking about good environmental subsidies that would benefit, well, the global economy in some ways? Is that a starting point to get more precise, at least about some subsidies that you'd really think are good, or others, like perhaps fossil fuel subsidies, that should stop?
Yeah, well, first of all, really, thank you very much for the very rich discussion. I have at the end probably more questions, even more questions than I had before. Yes, of course, the G7 is reflecting sort of what how to address issues like environment in the context of level playing field. Just to give you one example, I think we will not have a global deal on everything, but just to give you one example, I think there is the arrangement on green steel, and how should we define that? When is something green? How can you support it, etc. I think that is for me a good example of sort of how we can work. I think we should not try to solve the world with one big thing, but we should rather sort of develop pilots where we move forward and then expand the pilots to other sectors. I think that would be something I would find quite useful. Another discussion that takes place, I think, at G7 level is the Climate Club. That's not really about subsidies so much, but it is, I think, also about sort of fostering climate action. If I may, I think if I may ask one or two questions. One question was about subsidies, and it would be, I think, quite interesting for us to have an overview of what are the new forms of subsidies that are not yet covered by the WTO rules. And I'm thinking there particularly about Gabrielle, but maybe also Mikko has some insights, sort of what countries develop in terms of new subsidies. Then I very much agree with Marion on that even if you decide on the introduction of a sort of state aid or subsidy, you have to design it in a way that it is least distortive and as market driven as possible. Yeah. So if you are saying, okay, we want to have more renewable energy, how can you do that? And I think it would be very interesting to see whether you have from OECD some ideas how to design, so advice on the design. And then the colleague who asked from WWF, who said there should be no subsidies in the fossil fuel sector. And I think on this general level, I'm very much, I think, in agreement that we should really move out of fossil fuels, and that also means, of course, no subsidies. But what do you do as the government if you see that one of your companies that is supplying gas to consumers in Germany has difficulties, and there's a risk that the company is no longer able to supply, which will mean that there might be no heating, no gas for heating over winter. Would you rescue such a company, or would you be saying no, that's not really acceptable because it is a fossil fuel subsidy? I think that are sometimes the tricky questions that you, as sort of having the privilege, but also sort of the duty to work for governments. I think sometimes you have to take very difficult decisions in that sense. And then there's a last question I would like to ask, I think, to all panelists. I think when it comes to the distortion, there was a question of I think Marian has said there is a balancing exercise. So you might have very positive effects for environment or research, etc., but it might have a bad effect on the trade relations with another country. Let's be concrete. We all want to move into e-vehicles. So away from the fossil fuel, we want to have cars driving with electricity. For that, we need batteries, huge batteries. So if we give a big subsidy to a company that is ready to build up a battery in your country, you could say it's very good, because that means you can produce more cars that are driving environmentally friendly if the electricity is generated through renewables. But it might have a very bad impact on other countries which are also having already factories producing these batteries. So what is the right balancing in such a situation?
Thank you very much, Dominic. Much to cover for the last 10 minutes. Marian, perhaps I'd want to start with the last question and with you, because of course also you're looking at trade more broadly, and of course, let's say geoeconomic rivalry, mounting geoeconomic rivalry doesn't make these issues easier. So there's the green transition to be made, but of course, there are also these ideas of strategic sovereignty, autonomy after the pandemic, and with supply chains breaking down, you know, there are second thoughts about what are the kind of technologies that should perhaps also produce at home. So how do you see this balancing act, so identifying positive effects on the one hand, but then perhaps trade distortive effects on the other hand, and how can you come to a conclusion in the current context?
Thank you. And the battery example is an interesting one, and it allows me also to make a cross-reference to what Miko said, China's interest potentially in exchange on what to do and what not to do when it comes to the environment. China on certain areas may even already be advanced on us. China does not only have a critical position in the lithium battery chain, and those batteries are relevant for electric vehicles and therefore for our climate change trend, our green transition in the car industry. Not only do they have a dominant position in the battery chain, they have a totally dominant position in the recycling of lithium batteries. So in the most environmental aspect of it, the recycling, they're also dominant. That now brings me back to the Dominic's question. What if this is, I want to do something that is important for me, having batteries or a recycling industry, but somebody else is already in the market, and in there we do not have easy answers. And I think this is a bit a difficult new situation. I think the current situation has also led to some rethinking in our governments. The issue of we do not want to be in a situation where another country can coerce us into a certain type of behavior. So where a partner that we trade with cannot force us to do something because they can stop access to something that is totally essential for us. This is becoming a very important consideration for many of our members. And that's to some extent because some of our members have been experiencing that situation. I'm thinking of countries like Australia being exposed to important trade restrictions from China, or having now reactions from China regarding certain policy measures or decisions that Lithuania took with respect to the representation of a certain economy in its country. So this coercion issue is coming up very importantly. Is do we want others to be in a situation to force us to do something in geopolitics, with human rights, with environmentally, because they can stop access to something? This issue was not so predominant, at least not among OECD countries 10 years ago, as it is now. So this adds simply then to the difficulties we are facing. So no answers here. Traditionally, we would in a situation like this have rather focused on to which extent is there a market failure in the sense that there's an industry that would need to have to do research and development, and this is something we can justify to support. But when it comes to doing this in a way that helps you to bring a newcomer into the market and to start competing, and is one of the issues in the Airbus cases, for instance, this becomes tricky from a pure traditional WTO point of view. Now, in an attempt to add some solutions, to give some positive way forward to the discussions we have been having, and we see how very, very difficult and complex this is. And we haven't even touched, I saw a question on services, we haven't even touched on what do we do with sectors like health, where in some OECD members, this is considered to be a public sector, and in others, it's a private sector. So we haven't even touched that yet. If we stay in the difficulties we had, we already have discussed some ways forward in our thinking. What about the competitive neutrality concept? And I was glad to hear Gabrielle's view on this, because the WTO does not have an easy history with the theme competition policy. So I invite all of those listening to maybe delve a bit deeper into that history. Another issue where I think economists can help is the following. In a WTO dispute, and Gabrielle, correct me if I'm wrong, yes, we look at the balancing between to which extent do I meet the legitimate objective, and to which extent do I do this at a cost of distorting trade. But it's a second step of analysis. Am I using the most cost-effective instrument? So have I chosen the instrument that optimizes that balance? And there, unfortunately, economic research and economists do not provide enough cost-benefit analysis in order to give easy categorizations that Dominique was asking for. What is a good design and what is not? Yes, we have ideas, but there's no easy overview to make here. And here I would really call upon economists, maybe on research networks, do more in that area that looks too applied, maybe not interesting for international trade economists, but also for international trade economists, look at what is happening in that field, bring some public policy thinking that has been taking place in that area into the trade debate, because trade economists and trade lawyers badly need more information on the costs and benefits of the design of certain policies.
Thank you very much. And Gabrielle is raising her, has a two-hander, as we say at the OECD.
Now, I just wanted to add a small point in addition to the complexity. One possible approach, and these are just sort of ideas, is to keep the basic framework we have, that some subsidies are always or basically bad, prohibited, and others it depends. It depends if they cause adverse effect. It depends on their level and circumstances. But in trying to improve this scheme, and I'm thinking of fossil fuel and the example of Marion on impact on prices, maybe we could think of a concept where a subsidy is for a period. During a period, it is tolerated at a certain level, so it is what we call an actionable subsidy. It's not prohibited, but depends on its effect. And after a period, then it becomes prohibited. We will need to, I think, use more transition period to deal with these complex political issue related to subsidies. And the other point, if you want to expand what is a subsidy, you need to go back to the initial basic definition: financial contribution by a government. So we could play with the financial, we could play with by a government. And finally, what Dominique said about club of club, I'm personally a great believer in that for climate change. I'm not sure how we would apply that to subsidies, but again, in the context of transition, I really think we need more flexibility and more dynamic approach instead of static rule that it's only always good and that sort of clear cut, because the situations are too complex and too horizontal. Many sectors are affected by a subsidy in the first sector. So I'm an optimistic, but we should use more, we should make interrelations between these prohibited and adverse effect type approach, and even the green subsidies. We need to become more sophisticated in our categorizations. Thank you.
Thank you. So for one question for you, Miko, perhaps if you have thoughts on, because Dominic asked, you know, these new subsidies, and you said subsidies, industrial subsidies in China are very dynamic, come in different shapes and forms. Whether you have any examples of subsidies that are perhaps not even yet covered by international agreements, but should raise some attention by practices in China. And another question I have is there in the Chinese research policy community, is there also this need that has been voiced by Marion, but also Gabrielle, to do research to understand whether a subsidy does harm, the cost-benefit analysis, because of course the cost-benefit can also just concern you as a country, right? You subsidize something and it's really ineffective. So how about the participation in these analytical tools that the panel has called for?
There's great research being done in China, but a lot of that is not being publicized anymore. I mean, just until I think 2018, there was a regular annual report on the advance of market mechanisms and principles. Unfortunately, not only the report is not public anymore, but the guy who did it is not visible anymore. There is good research, great researchers. They know a lot about the internal market mechanisms, and I think it's good to connect with them as much as possible, but there's a lot of constraints for that. We need to be realistic. One thought before we get to the details, maybe, and I know time is running. So competitive neutrality, there's limited buy-in for that in China. It was a very important advance, I think, by the OECD and the support by the European Union. There's more to be had there, but also, again, we need to be a realistic. SASAC, our friends at SASAC, claim that competitive neutrality should mean that a Chinese SOE compete better on global markets. That is something that we need to recognize. Again, it's a very contested field, but the venture point that you've provided for Chinese actors, I think, is quite effective, or has been for some time. It's a long way. To get to the specific, below market equity, I think, is a core element, and just a new development that we could mention, the prioritization of listings for technology intensive companies that have a lot of full state support enjoyed at the issuance of their equity, leads to high valuations, makes it easier for them to raise debts subsequently. So it's an important issue. Much more publicly visible and known at this stage are the numerous and large government guidance funds. We know too little about them still. We have figures. They've probably raised around $820 billion US dollars in the last 5 years, well, between 2015 and 20. So that is a well-known established fact. We don't know how to deal with that. And then if you look at below market debt, there's evidence that automotive, capital goods, hardware, semiconductor industry, they probably pay around 3% on their interest-bearing liabilities, and that's compared to 5.3 average lending rate for general loans. So that in itself is already a massive advantage, and I don't think we have the tools or even the analytics more broadly to deal with that.
Okay, yes, Gabrielle, please.
Very briefly, and I don't want to get into a legal sort of battle. I'm not sure that these subsidies are not already covered by existing rules, the below market, the loans at preferential rate and all that. I'm not sure, I would not say they're not covered. That's all I wanted to say.
And we're even past our time, I will give, I think, many open questions, but I will give Dominic the opportunity to close. But I do want to give him 2 messages from the audience, because that's the purpose of this this exercise. So one thing, I'm not sure whether you can read the chat, Dominic, but Michael Lapp repeatedly has pointed out, well, you have to be careful about turning the OECD into a China bashing tool, but also in general, the G7 have enough of their own subsidies they need to look into better. He mentioned buy Britain first, buy America first. But he also had a constructive suggestion. He said, well, turn the G7 into G8 with China on this issue, then you can discuss together. And I have another question who comes from Kurt Abeshev. He's from German Watch. And Kurt, we're going to unmute you now, and then you can ask your question live. And it's going to be the last question of our round.
Thank you. My question was about G7 and that G7 had committed to end inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, adding to this unclarity about definitions another layer by 2025. And UK, for example, has claimed that it has no inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and it is hard to check this because of lack of transparency, and also this lack of agreed upon definition allows wiggle room for any bad actors in this case. And how, my question was to Dominic, how does G7 German presidency is trying to address this commitment and move the needle on this question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And Dominic, as I said, we are a bit past our time, but perhaps you have thoughts on the discussion, thoughts also on the questions, the proposals you received. And then unfortunately, we have to close this really, truly stimulating discussion about an important but complex issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was really a fantastic debate, a very rich debate, and I think our panelists were absolutely outstanding. And Gabrielle even got up in the middle of the night, so many thanks for that. Big applause. Yeah, I think what I think this discussion has shown to me is that a discussion on subsidies is hugely important for G7. It is really about level playing field. It's about fairness. It's about sort of avoiding or limiting the risk of distortions. But I think it has also shown that it has become a very strategic issue. And I think we have to pay a lot of attention to that in the new geopolitical world in which we are. So in that sense, I think it's I think very timely to discuss that in G7. I would also conclude from the discussion that unfortunately it's very often difficult to find black and white answers, and that is because there is a balancing to be done between potentially the positive benefits of a measure and also the distortions that it can lead to when comparing with sort of situations in other countries. The second point I would like to say is that I think the discussion has highlighted that there is a need for a proper implementation of the existing measures, in particular when it comes to transparency. And I think it would be good if we could really move forward there, but I am not sure sort of how we can enforce it better, the existing rules, but I think it would be very useful. And I think the discussion has also highlighted that in some areas we need to amend the existing rules. We had discussions about what is a subsidy. And I think we have all realized that some of the existing subsidies are not covered. We have had discussions about the distortions. What is a distortion? The balancing that is needed. I think we had a very good discussion about the design, the proper design of measures, so that they should be least distortive. So I think a lot has been said there, and I think we will also look at all the submissions that we have received through the chat. And last but not least, I think the issue of fossil fuel subsidies will deserve, I think, particular attention. It is, I think, a commitment from the G7 member states that they should all look at their own commitments in that respect. The idea of expanding the G7 to G8, I must say I'm a little bit hesitant. I think it is good to have also a forum where you can discuss between, I would say, like-minded countries where you would like to move. This does not mean that there should not be a very intense and good discussion with China, but whether it is in the G7/G8 context or within other contexts, I think that's a different question for me. But I think it's very important to engage with China on these things. But I think there has to be also one forum where we can discuss with like-minded how we would like to move forward. So with that, and a very big thanks to all of you, to the very rich discussions, the very good comments also in the chat that we will look at. I would like to thank everybody for this very good discussion today, and particularly to you, Nicola, for, as usual, excellent sharing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I say to everybody who's here in Europe, have a nice day. And to Gabrielle, good night. I hope you get some rest. And thank you, Marion and Miko, Dominic. It was a great discussion. And also the audience, I have to say.
And goodbye to everyone.